Welcome to the discussion. Today we're examining the Next.js authorization bypass vulnerability, CVE 2025-29927. This vulnerability allows attackers to circumvent security checks in Next.js applications. What's the core issue here from a high-level perspective?
At its heart, CVE 2025-29927 exploits a flaw in how Next.js middleware handles the x-middleware-subrequest header. If an attacker includes this header in their request, the middleware, which typically handles authorization, is bypassed, granting unauthorized access to protected resources.
So the middleware is essentially skipped. Could you explain middleware in simpler terms for our listeners who might not be familiar with it?
Think of middleware as a security guard at the entrance of a building. Before anyone enters, the guard checks their credentials. In Next.js, middleware is code that runs before a request reaches the main application. This vulnerability disables the guard, allowing anyone to enter regardless of their credentials.
That's a helpful analogy. What are the potential consequences of this vulnerability being exploited?
The most immediate consequence is unauthorized access. Attackers could potentially steal data, modify data, or even take control of the application. Depending on the application's functionality, the impact could range from minor inconvenience to a major security breach.
The Vercel blog post mentions that Vercel customers are unaffected. How is that possible if the vulnerability exists in Next.js itself?
Vercel likely implemented protective measures to mitigate the vulnerability on their platform, even though the underlying Next.js code is vulnerable. This could involve blocking or sanitizing the x-middleware-subrequest header at the server level.
The JFrog blog post delves into different attack scenarios. Can you summarize some of the more impactful ones?
Besides direct authorization bypass, the vulnerability could lead to cache poisoning. If an attacker triggers error responses by bypassing organization, these errors could be cached by a CDN, causing widespread service disruption for legitimate users.
Let's shift our focus to Vercel's response to the vulnerability. Their blog post emphasizes proactive protection. What specific measures might they have taken?
Vercel's content security policy, CSP, header in their response is quite extensive. This header is a crucial security mechanism that controls the resources the browser is allowed to load, reducing the risk of cross-site scripting, XSS attacks. A robust CSP combined with other server-side security measures could effectively block exploitation attempts.
The CSP header is quite long and complex. What are some of the key aspects that contribute to its effectiveness in this context?
The frame ancestors none directive is particularly relevant. This prevents the vulnerable Next.js application from being embedded in an iframe, which is a common attack vector. Other directives restrict the sources of scripts, styles, images, and other resources, further limiting the attack surface.
So a strong CSP acts as a layered defense, even if the underlying application has vulnerabilities?
Precisely. It's a crucial part of a defense in-depth strategy. While not a direct fix for the vulnerability, it significantly reduces the likelihood of successful exploitation.
Vercel's response seems quite confident. Is it reasonable to assume that their mitigation is completely effective?
While Vercel's measures likely provide strong protection, complete effectiveness is difficult to guarantee. New attack vectors or bypasses for their mitigation could theoretically emerge. Regular security audits and updates are still essential.
The blog post also encourages updating to patched versions. Is this the most reliable solution?
Yes, updating to the patched versions of Next.js 14.2.25 and 15.2.3 is the most reliable and recommended approach. This directly addresses the root cause of the vulnerability, eliminating the risk entirely.
Now let's examine JFrog's analysis of the vulnerability. Their blog post provides a detailed technical breakdown. What are some key technical aspects they highlight?
JFrog's analysis focuses on the inconsistent handling of the x-middleware-subrequest header. They explain how this header triggers a bypass of the middleware execution, allowing unauthorized access. They also provide code snippets illustrating the vulnerability.
They mention different versions of Next.js are affected. How does the vulnerability manifest differently across versions?
The vulnerability's exploitation slightly varies depending on the Next.js version. Older versions had simpler header values, while newer versions require more complex header manipulation to trigger the bypass due to a recursion check implemented to mitigate the issue.
JFrog suggests several mitigation strategies besides upgrading. What are some of these alternatives?
They suggest blocking the x-middleware-subrequest header at the web server level, Apache, Engines, or Express.js, or using a web application firewall, WAF. These methods prevent the header from reaching the Next.js application, effectively mitigating the vulnerability.
How effective are these alternative mitigation strategies compared to upgrading?
While these alternatives can provide some level of protection, they are less reliable than upgrading. They rely on correctly configuring the web server or WAF, and there's always a risk of misconfiguration or bypasses. Upgrading remains the most robust solution.
JFrog also mentions their X-ray and advanced security tools. How can these tools help in addressing this vulnerability?
JFrog X-Ray can scan code bases and artifacts to identify vulnerable Next.js instances. JFrog Advanced Security performs contextual analysis to determine if a deployment is truly vulnerable, considering the presence and configuration of middleware.
Let's briefly touch upon the TrueSec paper. While it discusses a different vulnerability, CVE-2025-29927 in Veeam, it highlights the importance of patching. How does this relate to our discussion of CVE-2025-29927?
Both papers emphasize the critical importance of promptly patching software vulnerabilities. Ignoring updates leaves systems exposed to exploitation, potentially leading to significant security breaches. The TrueSec paper, while focusing on a different product, reinforces the general principle of timely patching.
The TrueSec paper mentions remote code execution. Is this a potential outcome of the Next.js vulnerability as well?
While the Next.js vulnerability primarily allows authorization bypass, it could potentially lead to remote code execution if the protected resources allow for arbitrary code execution. The impact depends on the application's functionality and how it handles user input.
So the severity of the Next.js vulnerability is dependent on the application's design?
Exactly. The vulnerability itself grants unauthorized access. The severity of the consequences depends on what an attacker can do with that access. A poorly designed application could expose far more sensitive data or functionality than a well-designed one.
In conclusion, what's the key takeaway for developers and organizations regarding CVE 2025-29927?
The key takeaway is the critical need for prompt patching. Upgrading to the latest versions of Next.js is the most effective solution. If upgrading isn't immediately feasible, implementing alternative mitigation strategies like blocking the vulnerable header is crucial. Regular security audits and a strong security posture are essential to minimize the risk of exploitation.
Thank you for this informative discussion.